Welcome to Thoughts and Discourses on Digital Transformation. Dive into a world of insightful conversations and profound ideas.
Alrighty then, we're back for another episode, and I want to introduce Jeff Shepard. Jeff, we've known each other too long, 30 plus years, right? So back in the good old NetMetrics days and doing network and systems management. So you want to introduce yourself, and we're going to talk about some GenAI, right?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in coding and software development for years. You know, you and I worked at Hewlett Packard, did a bunch of startups, ended up at Oracle for a long time, and recently left to kind of pursue passion projects and, get my toes dipped back into some fun things. And most recently with GenAI.
Yeah, so let's talk about your passion project and how you actually got it off the ground, right?
Yeah, so I started doing some research into GenAI. You know, we were using that at Oracle for a while, and I flooded in LinkedIn now with all the things that they're doing nowadays with AI, agentic AI, and they had done some stuff with RAG, like you had done. And I was interested in this idea of using it for role-playing games. I used to play Dungeons and Dragons when I was younger, and I'm really kind of fascinated with that. In fact, throughout my career, I've kind of rebuilt a new generation of a game based on the latest technology. So I wanted to try it again with GenAI and really see, is it good enough to use in games?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating because there's an awful lot of hype that, like Zuckerberg said, we don't need developers anymore, paraphrasing him. And there's a lot of hype about, you don't need software engineers anymore because GenAI will do it. You don't need any marketing people because GenAI will do it, etc., etc. So you want to talk about your experience in having GenAI generate images and code, right?
Right. Yeah. It's funny because you talk about the one person, company, and there was an article in Forbes I just recently read, talking about these things. You use AI to do your marketing campaign, to do your coding, and you can get a lot more done. I do agree with this premise that it can amplify your work. I do, though, think that there still needs to be, or in my experience, a human involved. And I kind of like that part of it. For me, the first thing I started doing was when I started writing code is I went into Figma and I built out my UIs. You can go into Claude AI, for example, and have it build out you a React app, but material design and it's going to look like most standard enterprise applications or modern applications. But with a video game, the UI tends to be a lot more kind of unique and interesting, and not to say that it can't do that kind of stuff, but it's very design heavy. And so if you can go from Figma, a nice design there, into code, that's great. And so that's what I did. I tried out a couple of there are plugins for Figma you can get. They generate the code for you.
Now, does it generate just the HTML and CSS, or
well, that's what I had it do.
Interactive JavaScript behind the scenes?
No, I didn't have it do that. I had it generate the HTML and CSS. And then I would, take that and put it into a React component. And I had mixed results. I mean, the initial look and feel was great, right? And it looked like my Figma design. But then as I started coding, I wanted to adapt, one of the components I built to do something else or use it in a different context. And that's really where things started to kind of unravel a bit. So in terms of like building a reusable code artifact for a UI component and, have CSS, shared with it and have some flexibility in what the component could do, I ended up having to do a bunch of coding. And at the end of the day, I ended up refactoring and actually rewriting a lot of that code, factor it out.
So it was good for the initial work, but nothing for longer term or bigger projects?
Well, I don't know. I think the thing for me was, if you're in Figma, you can set up constraints and you can set up layout and make it really responsive.
Right.
And if you do all of that really well, the stuff that gets generated is pretty good.
Okay.
But then you're spending time, coding in Figma rather than coding in React. And, so to me, it just ended up being more efficient just to, just code it in React. I'm not saying that the tool can't do that. I just, feel like there's some things that it does pretty well, in terms of generating, the flex layout. But then, I ended up, modifying and enhancing that. And you know that from, large software projects over years and years and years, the code evolved, right?
Right.
And, adding on to it and extending what's there, I think is the challenge. And, if you've been in software long enough, you want to design up front reusable components so that when you have to build your 5th or 6th or 7th or 20th screen, it's super quick. And so that's where I invested the time building those components.
Yeah, that always seems to be one of the challenges with some of these tools is when you ask it to do something in addition, sometimes it massively refactors either the whole screen or the whole work.
That's
And all
right.
of a sudden it's like, wow, I asked for one simple thing
Yeah.
and it decided to change so much other stuff that, the design completely breaks or it,
Right.
the code breaks, right?
Yeah, and in fact, I was using I think it was Claude AI. I was playing around with touch-based drag and drop in a web app. Trying to do the touch controls so I can do it on my phone, and it generated some good stuff, right? But then there was this block of code that wasn't hooked up to anything, and it didn't do anything material to drag and drop. I'm like, where did this come from? And so I had to kind of rework that. But I did find out in the process, right? One of the things that I like using Cloud AI for sometimes is to get what's the current modern pattern for something like this, right? And an example of that, might be I was generating some code for an Android app, right? And it went and created the activity, but then it used like a view model built into that, and so that pattern, you don't have to you follow that pattern, but if that's kind of the dominant pattern that it's generating, it you start to kind of learn from that, and I think that's helpful, certainly for areas of code that you're maybe not.
Did you look at the quality of the code? Did you run it through any tools for software, dynamic application security testing or static analysis?
No, I haven't done that. But I've been code reviewing code for years and years and years, and some of it's pretty darn good, right? Certainly, especially like you get into TypeScript and you want to, manage your variables correctly, and it does that. There's this concept in React to use references and context, and it does good a job of those patterns. So I think some of the code is really good. I do find that it I hear people say, oh, it gets you 80% of the way there, and you still have to do 20%. I'm not sure if that's the exact percentage, but it's it gets you there. And what I find is, like, if you give it small tasks, it can do that really well, and then you just bring that into your larger structure, right? So I needed to do a photo, a photo app or a activity in an Android app to take a photo, and there's SDK APIs involved, and I hadn't really done that in a while, so I threw that problem to it, and it generated that for me, and I was able to kind of take that and kind of integrate it into the larger app. So I think this idea, at least my current thinking, is for little coding tasks, where you have a larger architecture kind of set up and you know what you want to do. You can have it do that coding task, so you're not spending your time writing all this code, which is almost boilerplate. If you've worked on a lot of code bases, with human programmers, you see a lot of copy and pasted code, and you can see the telltale signs of it, right? So, it's similar to that, but better, right? And I'm thinking, these days about software engineering languages, right? I had this buddy of mine who used to give me crap for coding in Java because he was working at Atari writing video games in assembly and C. And then years later, I ran into him where was it the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, and he said, "Hey, I want to let you know I'm writing games in JavaScript now," and I was like, "Oh boy," you know. And I think that that's it. The languages keep evolving, and one way I'm starting to think about AI is it's maybe a new programming language, right? Maybe you're not writing the instructions for the computer, or you're not writing algorithms using APIs from libraries. Maybe now you're just writing prompts. And you get really good at writing the prompt, you can get a good result, and then you know how to piece that together to build your application. So
Yeah, I think the challenge is gonna be how do you break the application into chunks, right? So it's about the
yes,
design, because
right,
the problem with prompts, right? You can run the prompt the same time within the same context, and you'll get a different answer, right?
sure, yeah,
So
yeah, I've
this
seen
is
that.
the challenge is you're better off doing the work in advance to break things into chunks so that you can limit the blast radius when the code goes slightly awry. But then how do you build up these common
Hmm.
modules or common components that
Right.
drive kind of the base functionality and base set of features, right? Have you
Yeah,
thought
and
through
the
that?
microservices architecture. I mean, I think that's it, right? You put together good architecture, component based design, and farm out these small parts of it to access microservices. That I think it can do that. Yeah,
Now, how did it get on for doing image generation? There's an awful
yeah.
lot of hype around that. How
Oh yeah.
well did it work for you, especially with some of your intricacies that you needed, right?
Yeah, I know you probably saw my LinkedIn post about that. I had been doing some research trying out the different Gen AI for images, to see what it could do. Right. The concept for this game. I don't know if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, but you have a guide that's leading adventurers an adventure, and they play the role. It's called role playing. They play the role of a character, and as a guide, I would come to the game with some stuff prepared, some maps, some pictures, and some idea of how we wanted the story to go. But really, the way the players work is they say, "Hey, I want to go, down that hallway, or up that mountain," and you'd be like, "Well, I didn't really prepare anything for that," and rather than stop them, you want to let them do that, and so when I looked at Gen AI, I'm like, well, wouldn't that be a great way to, allow, real time generation of content to follow wherever the story ends up going, right? To climb that mountain. And, well, I don't have any maps there. Well, let's generate some maps for you. So you have it. I don't have any, encounters there. So let's generate some of those. And let's generate some images to give some visual texture to it. And so I ran into some problems when I was looking at image generation. And the first one was in bows and arrows. And the classic thing, I even saw a post on this just the other day of the classic way to detect a generated image or video is to look at the fingers, because you often get 6 fingers, 7 fingers. And with bow and arrows, which hand's holding the bow, which hand's holding the string and the arrow, and how does it work? And it turns out Gen AI was pretty awful on it. I tried, Mid Journey, I tried Stable Diffusion, Dolly, and it took multiple iterations, and it wasn't that great. Um,
So how did you work around that?
Well, it's interesting because my focus was not in building a model, right? I think there are a lot of good models out there. My focus was in how to create the prompt to get the result I wanted. And I think part of the problem is these models don't necessarily have enough good data for that particular use case. And so it didn't really know how to handle it. I did try prompt engineering, and at the end of the day, that didn't move the needle as much as just trying and trying again, and eventually stumbles upon, something that looks a lot better. And I thought, that was, you know,
Kind
not
of
great
brute
from.
force attack
Yeah,
there, right?
but it's not great, right? You don't really want to be sitting there, particularly in a game. Generate. You want to be, moving along. Um, I posted one of the images I generated. There's a Reddit subreddit on AI generated art for role playing games, and I posted it there, and I got hammered. They were just, flames, really tearing it up.
Yeah, Reddit groups are so polite to everybody.
Yeah, they are, but these guys were good. At least one of them, he was very critical, very, very critical. And I engaged with him, and he, enumerated all the things he saw problems with. So I worked on it, and I went back and I did a follow-on post and looped him in, to show the improvement. And, I think, there's a level of quality that these folks are expecting. And, you got to meet the minimum bar. And I was the newbie coming in with some pretty crappy pictures. But, one of the other guys on that thread, was a little bit more constructive. And, he was pointing out the difficulty he's had with bows and arrows as well. And, as I dug into it further, there were some problems there. But I eventually, got some good images with bows and arrows. So that problem, can eventually be overcome. And I think, the models get better over time, for sure.
Yeah, and have you noticed with the different versions of, OpenAI, or have they improved how they do their image generation in a short period of time?
Oh, sure. Yeah. In fact, I've been using Midjourney a lot, and recently they added this capability to qualify the images you're using as input. Whether it's an image that's referencing the characters that you're trying to render, or a style that you're trying to render. And so that improvement, I think it's probably only like a few weeks old, or at least I just noticed it only a few weeks ago, and it definitely helps. I went back and retried some of the things I did earlier, and it got a little bit better. The second problem I had, we talked about bows and arrows, but the second problem I had is with groups. In role-playing games, you're usually with a group of people. And if you have a character, you want your character to look a certain way. And so from one picture to the next, you want your character to kind of look the same, not look different. Right. So I did this kind of pseudoscientific study. I picked a redheaded female, because I feel like redheaded generation can kind of be a little bit difficult to get, unique styles in. So I had two redheaded females to see if I can have a consistent look of person A and person B throughout the different generations. And then I picked a male with a completely different skin color to see if they, if I put the three together and have a succession of images, how good could it get? How good could it be at generating those three people in successive images? And I got terrible results. For the life of me, they could not get the skin color right. The male, the females ended up just looking interchangeable for a while. And it took a lot of iterations.
Now, by each iteration, is that a different prompt? So is it more prompt engineering evolution for you, or is there something
There's some
else
of that, yeah. There's some, these tools have different controls you can play around with. And, some of it is just try again, right? So in Midjourney, you can just say rerun it. Or you can double down on one that you like and say do a variation of this one. Same prompt, same input, plus, the variation on it to see if it gets better. And so the group problem is the other problem. I don't think it's I don't think they've solved that yet. I don't think that's great. But when I take a step back and look at using it in my game, it doesn't have to be perfect, at least for my game application, right? So if you make the analogy back to coding, right? If you give it a small task and it produces that, that's good enough to use in a bigger picture, right? So if I'm doing a picture and it generates it, maybe it's good enough for the story that I'm playing. Either I'm using my imagination to say, oh, well, that's close enough, or I'm using the image in a slightly different way than they might have intended it.
So how fast did you think you were able to do it compared to just coding it all from scratch? Was this twice as fast or 3 times, or you would have shrunk down the size and scope of the game to get it live?
Yeah, I do think it was faster, for probably at 50% faster. But that was more on me. If I was just looking at, hey, let me throw together whatever I can to get this thing going. I could have done it much faster, right? But I wanted it to be well architected. I wanted it to be scalable. I wanted to make sure it was set up for, internationalization. So I was doing a lot of, kind of nuts and bolts things that you do when you're building a sustainable software product. And so I was investing time in that, right? In my component library, in my reusable, bits of code, panels and patterns. And so I think that, meant that I took more time on it than maybe I might have if I just wanted to get this out and do that. I did have an early version of this that I play tested right away, right? That was like 2 weeks.
Oh, really good POC. Was
Yeah,
it
yeah.
or close enough to proof
Well,
of concept it?
Yeah, enough to test the mechanics, right? The game, the core game loop is you're in play and you want to do something, but you want it to sound cool or you want it to look cool, right? I'm not an artist. I'm not a novelist, fantasy, wordsmith. So having the tool, is it good enough to stay in the flow of play and keep it exciting? And I think there are 2 things that I kind of came out of that. One is, yeah, sure, it is, and it got really inspiring to see some of this stuff come to life, and the second is it throws curveballs, it makes mistakes. But when you're playing a game, you adapt. You're going to say, oh, well, hey, it generated a picture of 5 people that look exactly alike. Well, no, they're brothers. They're at the table next to ours, and they're looking at us intently. Well, geez, now the story goes in a whole new direction. Who are these brothers, and why are they sitting at the table next to us? And you can go off in a whole new direction that way.
Great. So that's fantastic. So what's your next step? I think you're going to a trade show next week.
Well, yeah. So I'm taking this step at a time, right? I've been kind of skeptical. Is this going to work? And then I did a Kickstarter campaign. Is there anyone interested in this? And I advertised on Instagram, and I had a successful Kickstarter campaign. Did that, met the goal, and now going to PAX East, which is a gamers conference in Boston in early May, and I got a booth. My brother's coming out to run the booth with me, so we'll be there having people try out the game and writing a story. We're actually gonna, during the course of the show, we're gonna write a story day to day, and so we'll be able to go back after and read it and see how good it is.
So what's the name of the game, and do you know your booth number?
Oh yes, LegendFolk. Let me see if I can.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, these are my banners, LegendFolk. And we're booth 14110 at PAX East. So we'll be there. And if anybody's watching this before then and in the Boston area, please stop by, say hi. Love to show you the game and get your feedback.
Great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us about your experience in GenAI development of a game. So I look forward to hearing more about how your journey evolves and how good things get for you. Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Colin. Good to be on here and good to see these. I like your podcasts on LinkedIn. It's really good to see them.
So. Thanks. Bye.